Welcome to The Outsider Philosopher. Today I'm issuing a personal challenge to Robert Sapolsky to come on my channel and to take on a series of thought experiments that I believe challenges his position of what I would call super determinism. The reason I would call it super determinism is just a way to really focus the issue, and that would be that his take on free will, or his take on the absolute absence of free will, is synonymous with a superdeterminist position, which in itself is synonymous with a belief that the only causal power in the universe is the conservation of momentum, that energy is being exchanged through particles, and the energy of a moment ago informs what's happening in this moment, and what's happening in this moment, the arrangement of particles and their conservation of momentum, is what's affecting the moment after that. And that when you understand that that's his thesis, then it's not necessary to go, down all these different rabbit holes, or to get buried under his, mountain of academic achievement, right? He can just cite things, left and right. And as a layperson, you can just look at that mountain of information and go, oh, well, there's no way I can compete with that. So I'm just going to trust the person that's on top of that mountain and take them on their word. And I think this is extraordinarily dangerous. We're already, dealing with fraying of the fabric of society. And when somebody like Robert Sapolsky, with great authority, comes along and tells us something, so profound in its way that we have no free will, and that the only thing that's really playing out is the conservation of momentum in matter, that can only have negative consequences for society, for the notion of truth, for the notion of responsibility, of purpose. As much as he will try to rescue all that stuff, it just doesn't follow from his own position. So it's a personal challenge. Now I know I have an extremely small channel, but there's some chance that he's like the rest of us and he goes on YouTube on occasion, and YouTube randomly throws up suggestions, and maybe he will find this particular video, listen to it, and have the academic, the intellectual honesty to say, okay, I'm going to take on the small guy. I'm going to go on some small guys. The conservation of momentum is leading me to take on this small guy and to take on his series of thought experiments that may challenge my core thesis. So I would like to share what I believe to be a thought experiment that really cuts at the core of a super determinist position. And now there are a lot of people that take this position. Sabine Hofstadter and Sam Harris are two people that come to mind that take this same position. And so to me, to understand what's really going on, what's at risk, and just really clarify the issue, it really does boil down to some simple claims. On the one side, the determinist position, the superdeterminist position, is that it's just the physical laws playing out through the particles in the universe, and that there's no room for anything other than that. So that is one way of looking at things. To me, then, there are all these super absurdities that flow from that I won't get into here, but you can just see that then in each one of these people. Look at Robert Sapolsky, Sam Harris, Sabine Hofstadter. Listen to their conversation, and they can't stay in congruence with their own claim. They will make if statements, but statements, should statements, could statements, and they will bring some level of moralization to what they're saying. None of those things flow from conservation of momentum being the only causal power in the universe. You can't say but, you can't say if, you can't say should, you can't say this is good, this is bad, or what most people do these days. Well, this is positive, this is negative. I don't judge good and evil, but I'll say something's positive, I'll say something's negative, and if I'm pushed on the definition of that, well, positive is good, negative is bad. None of that flows from conservation of momentum because it's just conservation of momentum. Nobody can say or do anything differently than what they're doing exactly at that moment because that's what's been programmed in the moment before it, all the way back to the beginning of time. So all of these people who claim superdeterminism can't live within superdeterminism, and that's just one example of the absurdity that flows from it. Though, as a logical claim, there is a certain consistency to it. Superdeterminism within its own logic can account for all of the positions and momentums of particles. Forget the uncertainty principle, but generally speaking, why are these particles here at this time with this momentum? Superdeterminism can explain all that. It can't, however, explain the meaning associated with that, consciousness, all those sorts of things. And so the languaging that comes from people who claim superdeterminism can never be consistent with that claim because language always presupposes free will. As a matter of fact, I have a thought experiment that I believe both establishes the fact of free will and establishes it as the necessary precondition for language. That's one of the thought experiments that I would challenge Robert Sapolsky to come on and engage in. All right, so today's thought experiment has to do with a weakness in the superdeterminist argument. So superdeterminism, there is no free will, right? There's all this absurdity that comes with a superdeterminist viewpoint, but at least there's not the magic that would be necessary for free will. And so what a superdeterminist would say is, well, you can't point to this supposed free will. Show me this magic, and you can't do it. And the answer is no, I can't point to this magic. As of yet, I can't, put my finger on it, and there it goes. But you can't also disprove that magic. You can actually do no more with your position than I can do with mine. And here's how that flows. Here's how that works out. And here is what I believe to be a logical problem that superdeterminism cannot surmount. So this is, as bare bones, a logical and mathematical argument against superdeterminism that I believe could be made. So I can't point at the thing that's free will, but you can't also disprove free will. Here's why. In order for you to disprove free will, you would have to calculate the entire universe. You would have to calculate all forces, all positions of all particles, all their momentums. This is Laplace's demon. And you assume that theoretically that could be done. But I'm going to show you here in a very, what I believe to be Gödelian fashion, that actually cannot be done. In other words, you could never do the thing you would need to do to prove your position. So what you would have to do is calculate all particles, all momentums, have all the conservation laws accounted for, and then check to see if there was a variance. Check to see if, based on initial condition A, when you get to final condition Z, that everything adds up between exactly as it should without any variance that would show you that there was some intervention of free will. This is where I'm going on this. So assume that there would be this calculation that would need to be done, and it would be the largest calculation of all time. And at the end of that calculation, either everything would be exactly where it should be based on the calculation, or there would be some variance. If everything was where it should be, superdeterminism would be true. If there was variance, we would have some shadow, some imprint, some fingerprint of free will. Let's assume that this calculation could be done. But before we go there, ask yourself this. Have you ever gotten a math problem wrong? In your entire life, have you ever added up or subtracted or divided or multiplied something and got it wrong? Of course you have. You were a kindergartner once. You were learning how to add and subtract, do basic arithmetic, and you got a problem wrong at some point in your life. Now think about that from a superdeterminist position, right? And this is cutting straight through. I'm sorry. This is where superdeterminism fails on a logical basis. When you got that problem wrong in kindergarten, you were no less the expression of fundamental forces than you are right now. And there's a guy named Stephen Wolfram, who's probably the world's greatest living mathematician, who believes that the universe is computation. And the conservation laws are never violated. You are a product of the conservation laws. How did you get basic arithmetic wrong? You did. And how did you know that you had gotten it wrong, and how did you learn to get it right? It's just perfect mathematics the entire way. So now, let's go to that final calculation, the biggest calculation in history of all time, the biggest calculation possible, where we calculate all the positions of the particles and all their forces, momentums, the whole thing. When you get that answer back and you realize that everything is where it's supposed to be based on the conservation of momentum, how do you know that's right? How do you know that's right? How do you know that that's not wrong, and it's not just the present expression of the conservation of momentum that led you to being wrong when you were a kindergartner? You have to step outside of the system to know the right or the wrong. That's Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Everyone who's a materialist does not understand Gödel's incompleteness theorem. You can't beat that, Robert Sapolsky. Come on my little channel and try to beat that. You can't beat it. And yes, I'm angry because I feel qualia. I understand meaning. And your position can't account for meaning. And you don't understand that because you don't understand the deep meaning of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But I just showed it to you. You could calculate all the particles and all the forces, and you would not know whether or not you had gotten it right or wrong, because you would just be playing out the fall of the domino chain from the beginning to whatever the end is when you've made that calculation. And knowing that you've gotten things wrong in the past, which were only the expression of the conservation of momentum, you would have no way of knowing if you had gotten it right to prove the conservation of momentum. So that's my challenge to Robert Sapolsky. I don't know, maybe there's no challenge at all because it's just, the domino chain falling as it's supposed to fall. But if for some reason some random, right? And you don't even allow for randomness in superdeterminism, or only the slightest little hint of it. But if somehow this shows up in your feed, take it on. You can't beat it. And I have other thought experiments that you can't beat either. And maybe you could come around to how dangerous your position actually is. And maybe you could look back in history and see where things looked like they made a lot of sense, looked like they were eminently logical and eminently moral on paper, and had awful real world consequences. Because I believe that's what you're doing at this moment. All right. You can find me on YouTube. I would love to have you on as my first guest. I don't think you can beat that thought experiment.